Welcome everyone to the next Future Of episode, featuring this time on the nefarious vampire counts. I bet you thought it was going to be another 3 months again, but nope, this one is thankfully pretty short I thought when I was writing this script, so I'm just going to go ahead and knock it out. I was wrong! So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the changes to the current content section. Just a reminder, these Future Of videos are not demands or even requests of the developers, but merely suggestions and brainstorming ideas to engage the community in a conversation to try and make a good game truly great. I want to really emphasize, these are not demands or requests of the devs. That's not what they are, so please don't treat them like that. These are just ideas for brainstorming to get people talking. Let's start with the zombies. The first thing I'd like to open with is a small note on something that I've found a little odd. It seems that for some reason the basic undead infantry of zombies and skeletons are bizarrely heavy. If a unit of cavalry or even monstrous cavalry is fighting amongst zombies and skeletons, they seem to really struggle to push out of the combat, even though they should have a much higher mass. I'm not sure if this was an intended design or not, but it's something I wanted to point out and it may need to be looked at. Especially as, the raised dead summoning is kind of an important mechanic for vampire counts. But it seems like, demigryphs and horses for like mounted characters should be able to just kind of push through them and knock them over and get them out of the way, but for some reason that doesn't seem to work. Alright, moving on to more important matters. The next group I want to look at for the vampire counts is the Crypt Horrors. Once the most terrifying unit on the battlefield and hated by most of the multiplayer community, they have fallen quite far from grace, so to speak. Although I am adamantly opposed to them being as powerful as they were in their prime of Warhammer 1, currently the unit seems to really struggle to find a place in the Vampire Counts roster. Not sure if the best solution would be to make them slightly more durable or more offensive, but they could use some tweaking to be a bit more effective. As an aside, the Crypt Ghouls could also do with a similar look, though I would recommend increasing their melee attack or just their weapon strength, as they should be the most aggressive and offensively focused basic infantry in the Vampire Count roster. For the Crypt Horrors, maybe they can have like a small anti-infantry bonus, or maybe just some basic stat boosts. But both of the Crypt units could use just some tweaking and some looking at. They just kind of feel like they've fallen awkwardly. So in a similar vein to the Crypt Horrors, moving on, though in a notably worse spot in my opinion, the Vargheists need a pretty solid buff to be made more effective. For some reason, larger flying units like Pegasus Knights and Vargheists seem to be really struggling in Warhammer 2. It may be their charging AI needs a pretty serious looking at, but on top of that, the Vargheists are just too squishy for their current damage output. Either they need a moderate health pool increase, or their ability to cause damage in a prolonged battle needs to be improved quite a bit. Note when I say prolonged battle, I mean like prolonged fight on the ground, not a long battle. I do think for the Vargheists, their main flaw seems to come from the idea that they were intended to be powerful cycle chargers. But currently the game, something about the transition from Warhammer 1 to Warhammer 2, something happened where those charging units, like Vargheists and Pegasus Knights, just don't work very well. A lot of them just miss on the charge, or, they do charge, but it's very awkward. And I think the larger unit sizes probably are at the core of that, because for those of you who don't remember, from Warhammer 1 to Warhammer 2, almost every monstrous unit increased in size, which for the Flyers seems to have dramatically impacted how their charge animations work and how like the AI coding behind it works. So maybe they just haven't looked at that yet, which could very well be the case, because none of the new factions of the 5 for Total War Warhammer 2, none of them had a notable monstrous infantry or cav unit that could fly. All their flyers were either man-sized or big spooky things. So maybe that's what it is. It's just with the increase to the unit size, the AI hasn't been properly adjusted and they just kind of crash and burn. Hopefully that's something we can take a look at, and we'll talk about this again when I do the Future of Bretonnia, and that's going to be a huge part of that video, is talking about these flying chargers. But for the Vargheists, They just need to be way scarier. Either they need much more boosted combat stats, or they need way more health and maybe some melee defense. Because right now you have to engage them and leave them engaged for them to really be able to get any value. And they just can't right now. They'll just die almost instantly. Like, shooting tears them up, but combat, they just aren't worth their pretty high price. So hopefully that's something that can be looked at. The final units we'll be looking at for alterations is the collection of ethereal units belonging to the vampire counts. They are just terrible right now. Hex race and Cairn race desperately need vast improvements to their defensive and offensive capabilities. In tabletop, these units were pretty terrifying, as they were completely immune to non-magical damage, unless you could overwhelm them with combat resolution, which was hard. They hit like absolute trucks, and were difficult to pin down due to being able to pass over or through terrain without penalty. But in Total War Warhammer, they have become all bark and no bite. Their defenses are so poor that enemy units can easily destroy them through combat or shooting, even without magical support. And should magic enter the equation, they will literally evaporate. It should be one or the other. Either they should be completely immune to physical damage, but suffer massively due to crumbling and magic, or they should be vulnerable to normal damage, but be much more resistant against magic and leadership issues. Ethereal units are supposed to be some of the most elite creatures that the vampire counts can field, and right now they're just a joke. To add on to this, they're also just terrible at dealing damage. Cairn race and Hex race are supposed to hit like absolute trucks. I mean, they're great weapon-wielding units that, although quite expensive, should cleave through heavily armored infantry and cavalry. The weakness of these units is supposed to be tar pit units with high melee defense, or magic resistance, or health, who can just lock them down and prevent the ghosts from getting their money's worth elsewhere, or of course being nuked to death by magic damage. To make it blunt, ethereal units should be a strong gamble. They should be very expensive and with a built-in death trigger by magical damage. But if the VC player manages to keep them protected until enemy magic is negated, then ethereal units should be insanely effective and dangerous. You know, basically they should be the kind of unit that if you don't have magic damage available to you, you should see them be like, oh crap, I'm gonna have to dedicate some serious resources either to lock them in place and surround them so that they collapse due to leadership issues, or, you know, just hold them off until I can kill the rest of the army and cause army losses. So that they really seriously need a deep looking at. I've talked with a few members of the competitive community before I wrote a lot of these notes, but for single player and multiplayer, I think all these changes would be really good to take a look at. So moving on from ethereal units to ethereal character, the Banshee is in an okay place overall, though my previous notes also do apply to her when talking about ethereal stuff. More importantly though, I would really like to see her get the Banshee Scream as an active ability. A Banshee without a Scream just ain't a Banshee. She's just an ugly ghost hag who nags somewhat dangerously. A 2 or 3 use active ability that causes significant damage to a single entity as she shrieks chilling terror into their veins would be so fitting and amazing. It could either be a smaller version of the Terrorgeist Scream attack, whose ability in tabletop was literally just a bigger version of what the Banshee has always done, or it could be like a lesser Spirit Leech. Regardless though, let's upgrade the resident Casper the Friendly Tart into a proper Banshee. Pretty please. So, moving into the Lord categories now, let's talk about the Ghoul King. I do think the Strigoi Ghoul King is a ton of fun. Our lovely beastly descendant of Ushoran could use some minor tweaks, however, to make him a more competitive choice, especially when he's on foot. Back in the days of Warhammer 1, he could actually be decently nightmarish after the DLC release, but his main strength is found in that he brings both the hunger and regen to the table. But this became a bad thing when healing caps were introduced. Although I 100% believe healing caps were needed and honestly improved the game, the Ghoul King could probably use a small tune-up to compensate him for this change. But much like I've talked to some people about Vlad in the past, You know, the Ghoul King and Vlad are characters you have whose gimmick is that they can regen faster than anybody else. You know, Vlad has the hunger, then he can heal from casting magic, then he can heal from his sword Blood Drinker, and originally he also got more healing from his ring. This made him really powerful until they introduced the healing cap, and then it literally became hilariously stupid. But they fixed Vlad by making the ring into a damage resistance item, one use only, instead of a heal when you're really low on health item, which did a lot to fix him. So the Ghoul King is kind of in a similar situation where he has regeneration and the hunger, and he can also heal from magic, which can heal him very, very quickly, but it also prevents him the weakness to fire while not actually providing him with a great bonus, because, you know, he can regen in combat naturally and anywhere by casting magic naturally. So the regen is kind of more of a detriment than a positive. I almost think they need to kind of just tweak his health pool or something a bit. But in any event, the two main ways I would suggest compensating the Ghoul King because of the healing cap and also just making him better, especially on foot, would be the two following things. First is that the Ghoul King's unique form of Raise Dead, which summons ghoul units instead of zombies and skeletons, is way too expensive right now. It costs a ton of points for a summon that most people would accurately argue is worse than the regular Raise Dead. To make it a fair ability, I would recommend reducing the cost in gold, magic cost, and increase the number of times it can be used by 1 or 2. Of course, buffing the Crypt Ghouls and Crypt Horrors, as we discussed earlier, would also help notably. But right now, it's a terrible ability, just because the units you're summoning aren't great. You can only do it, I think, 2 times max, which pretty much sucks, and it's so expensive. So you're punished so heavily for taking it. It needs to be vastly brought down, so you're getting your money's worth out of it. It needs a buff, and you could use more uses, and you could use everything being cheaper about it. Long story short. The second thing is that although the Ghoul King is a decent combatant while on a Terrorgeist, he's otherwise just not that great compared to other options due to his pretty high cost and not having any really standout abilities. He does have a single target Bloodlust ability, but honestly, I would like to see him have a unique upgrade to represent his Eternal Hatred ability in Tabletop. An exceedingly rare ability, Eternal Hatred made the Ghoul King an incredibly dangerous combatant, as it was rare for him to miss. I think the best way to interpret this ability would be to give the Ghoul King either an active or passive skill that increases his melee by a solid +5 or more. If CA wanted to make it really spooky, it could instead increase the melee attack of all troops within 20 to 40 meters by a small amount, which would make him a really interestingly aggressive buff lord, while also giving him a small way to help the vampire counter their poor melee attack as a faction, since especially because he doesn't have the Dance Macabre spell. So I don't think it would be too overpowered on him. You know, if you had the Strigoi Ghoul King providing a +5 melee attack to everyone within 40 meters, you could also combo it with like a hero Necromancer who does bring Dance Macabre and overcast it to try and further buff your troops, along with like a Corpse Cart to get a little bit more of a buff, which could make for a really interesting aggressive army. But the Strigoi Ghoul King and the Necromancer are much, much more vulnerable than their counterparts of the generic Vampire Lord, any of the special characters, and of course the Vampire Hero for the Necromancer, or the Banshee even. Those are the risky choices to take of the Necromancer and the Ghoul King. So if they had like a really interesting gimmick to really reward you for taking them, I think that would really not only make them more popular, both in single player and multiplayer, but would just make them more fun and thematic to use. So yeah, the Ghoul King just, he needs a lot of touching up. Alright, we're done with all the generic spookies, so let's go ahead and progress to Legendary Lords. So let's talk about Gorst. I've outspokenly considered him as one of the worst characters in the game, second only to Duke Alberic. But we're here to try and suggest repairs instead of just bemoaning a wasted Legendary Lord slot. Honestly, Gorst isn't all that terrible, he just suffers from one critical issue. He is so damn slow. If you take Gorst onto the battlefield, you better pray to whatever gods you believe in your opponent doesn't have any shooting, any aggressive magics, or any breath attacks, because if he does, you're going to get absolutely obliterated. The Corpse Cart King is at his most interesting and valuable on his mount, the Brothers Gorst cart, which has some pretty nice buffs and mechanics, but once again, it's just so slow, it's just too slow. So here's the proposed solution. I think the one change that would make Gorst go from the ultimate letdown to being actually interesting as a lord would be if, while on his corpse cart, he provided all undead within 40 meters with a substantial speed bonus. We're talking like 20% at least here, but feel free to go much higher. This would not only allow Gorst to cross the field in a more reasonable span of time, but at least would give him a hope of dodging insta-kill projectiles and make his army selection much more interesting, as he could take zombies and other corpse carts capable of actually putting on a little hustle, which would be really interesting, because the reason a lot of people don't take those kinds of units is just because they're too slow. So you take too much punishment on the advance, or your opponent just flies his dragon over, what have you, and just farts in your general direction and all your stuff dies, because it's all regenerating, which makes you vulnerable to breath attacks, notably, and the fireball spell, and both of those things do colossal damage and are hard to dodge on a good day. So if he had like a really interesting speed buff for everyone near him, that would actually be super cool, but I would only have it in his corpse cart form. I want to make that clear. I don't think he should have it on his foot form, because on foot he moves reasonably fast. He just doesn't really have any cool, super interesting abilities. As a final thought on him though, although there is not a lore or tabletop justification for it, the poor Gorst on a corpse cart would really be more viable if he could get an additional plus 10 to 15% missile resistance, so that when the hilarious number of flame-based projectiles in this game hit him, he doesn't just turn to ash on contact. And that can honestly go for Master Necromancers on carts too. Just not a ton, just 10 or 15%, so that they have a chance to get to the line. Because unlike tabletop, you can't just hide these guys behind your lines like you would there. These characters are exposed, and even if you put them in a unit, the corpse carts are surprisingly large, and units won't protect them from missile fire or large projectiles. So you're just kind of on your own. I think it would be pretty reasonable to give them a notable little push. Alright, so the final characters for the changes to current content section I'd like to briefly discuss is Vlad and Isabella von Karstein. All I want to ask for them is to please, please, please have their Loremaster of the Lore of Vampires skill and campaign be removed. Loremaster is an exceedingly rare skill in Warhammer that very, very few casters are worthy of. Only the absolute best can claim such a power, which the undead lovers are most certainly not. Isabella was an absolutely terrible adept at the arts of magic, being a mere level 1 in tabletop, which is the worst you can be while still being a wizard. Vlad was certainly powerful in his own right, but his skills laid in combat, leadership, and being damn near impossible to kill instead of magical ability. Vlad was only a level 3 wizard in tabletop, which the max is 4, and the only reason he was capable of his extremely famous ritual that he used to launch the beginning of the Vampire Wars, where he raised most of the dead in Sylvania, is because the first von Karstein used an absurd amount of warpstone and lore from the books of Nagash to vastly improve his ability for that cataclysmic summoning spell. Comparing them to the likes of Manfred von Karstein, Zacharias the Ever-Living, or Heinrich Himmler makes Vlad look more to a skilled novice at the arts of necromancy. So please, remove the Loremaster skill from these two so they more accurately reflect their tabletop designs. Loremaster should be reserved only for the most powerful casters for each respective lore. The last subject to cover in the changes to current content section is that the campaign raise dead mechanic has gotten way out of control, especially when the AI is wielding it. So just to reiterate, we're talking about the raise dead mechanic in single player campaign or multiplayer campaign. We are not talking about the spell raise dead. We're talking about that little mechanic you can use to recruit troops. So currently, it is extremely easy for the vampire counts to simply build a cheap 20 stack of zombies, run forward to fight an enemy, and have all their troops die, then proceed to just resurrect them the next turn as Blood Knights and Terror guys by about turn 5 or 10, if they throw enough armies at it. This is just absurd, and needs to be slapped with the reasonable nerf hammer. My proposal to fix this is one of two things. Either the raised dead mechanic needs to drastically increase the amount of corpses needed to recruit tier 4 to 5 units, or players/AI simply shouldn't be able to recruit these tier 4 to 5 units, utilizing the raised dead mechanic. Raising a Vargulf, Mortis Engine, or Black Coach from a pile of random corpses doesn't really make that much sense anyway. Perhaps the ability to raise these higher tier units from the raised dead mechanic should require an unlock, a special unlock on the skill tree that you get at like level 20 or level 30. Or maybe it could be unique to the Master Necromancers to make them truly unique in campaign and cement them as the summoning focused class. This would make the mechanic more engaging and prevent its grotesque abuse by the AI, who currently just spam insanely powerful armies every turn with brutal speed and ease, which just sucks to fight against. Because the AI already cheats a lot in this game, but when you're fighting the vampire counts, and they're literally spawning full 20 stacks every 2 turns at the highest tier units in the game, it is just brutal. And like I said, for the Raised Dead, it would be really cool to see it actually be like a tiered mechanic, where maybe Master Necromancers are the only ones who can raise the really powerful things once they hit, level 20. Or maybe everyone can do it when they hit level 20. It would really just make their campaign a lot better, both, in my opinion, when you're playing it and when you're playing against it. Because right now, I think in both forms, the Raised Dead mechanic is brutally abused. I don't remember it being such a problem in Warhammer 1, but in Warhammer 2, it is a huge problem. And I'm not sure exactly what caused it. But for whatever reason, it's just an ability that, although it works really well and it's thematic and fun, I just really would like to see it put into a more interesting light where you actually kind of have to work for it or, invest in it, instead of just being able to just fart out, 2 Mortis Engines, 3 units of Blood Knights, 2 Terror guys, a Vargulf, and a bunch of units of Graveguard just because you've literally just been fighting over the same territory or defending from the AI suiciding itself against Castle Drakenhof. So that finishes up the current content section. Like other videos right now on the channel, I'm kind of running an experiment at the moment, both for y'all's benefit and mine, to see if breaking up the super long videos into parts makes them perform better. So just like we did with the Norska Q&A, where we split it up into 3 30-minute segments, roughly, we're going to be doing the same thing here. I'm going to have the changes to current content video, then the recommended free LC section, and then the recommended DLC section. Though those two I might combine, but I think they're going to be separate. In any event, thank you all for joining me for this video. I hope you're having a great day, and please let me know what your thoughts are about my proposed changes, and feel free to recommend your own changes down below. Or I usually post the future of videos to Reddit, because they tend to do pretty well there and at least get some, or at least have some discussion. Hopefully we can, have an interesting conversation about this. For those of you wondering, I will be releasing the future of videos every morning at 7 a.m. Central Standard Time. So, this one comes out, I believe it's going to be August 31st, and then on September 1st, part 2 will come out at 7 a.m., and then September 2nd, part 3 will come out on 7 a.m. as well. Unless I combine those two, but I've got like 10 pages. So I thought the Vampire Counts was going to be super short, but that's not how it ended up being. So in any event, thank you all for joining me. I'll have more stuff in the future, and I hope you all have a great night. I'm going to stop talking now. Catch you guys later.